Sheen, Bojo, Mishike and Dodam, Shkudenigan, Wawasquanen and Dijnakas, Shawanagan Dunjaba, Nishinabe, Kwe, Ojibwe and Dao. I bring greetings in the language of my ancestors and introduce myself in that good way. I am Grandmother Kim Wheatley. My spirit name is head or leader of the fire flower, and I am Turtle Clan. It is my great honor on this day to welcome each and every one of you to this 6 Degrees event, where you will undertake meaningful dialogues with each other in a good way, with a good heart and a good mind. And to assist you in doing that, I've prepared the smudge for you. And the smudge is a practice that we have where we light our medicines and we help you to take care of your minds, and we help you to take care of your hearts, and we help you to take care of your spirits so that you're engaging in a good way, that you're remembering to think only good things and to hear only good things and to see only good things and indeed to speak only good things. Of course, we want you to feel only good things. So all of these wishes I bring to you in that traditional practice and custom on this day. I also encourage you to remember the treaty and traditional territories upon which you are residing in. We have been here for time immemorial in this vast country known as Kanata, Canada. And on this day, I want to encourage you to give greetings and thanks to those that came long before us, who enable us on this day and indeed in every day to remember not only who we are, but to be responsible in our relationships to each other, to the lands, and to the waters. So with these wishes, with these good thoughts, with these encouragements, and with these practices, as grandmother, in the territory that I come from, I am sending you the greatest of respect, the greatest of hope for meaningful dialogue, and the greatest of wishes and welcomes to the 6 Degrees event. Be well. Ba mon pi gigawab min minawa.
Hi, well, here we are, the 18th LaFontaine-Baldwin Lecture with 9 of the 17 past lectures taking part. Our leader is Michael Sandel, the great philosopher and master of the Socratic conversation and the 15th LaFontaine-Baldwin Lecturer. He's taken a break from the launch of his new book, The Tyranny of Merit, to be with us. So, why a lecture series named for Louis Philippe Lafontaine and Robert Baldwin? 2 points. 1842. They were in their early 30s, the leaders of the democratic reform movement. News came from Paris. They had been elected vice presidents of the International Anti-Slavery Society. It was a cause that they were devoted to throughout their lives. 1848, March 11th, they win power. The first democratic government to emerge from the 5 European and American empires. How do they pull this off? Well, theirs was a movement devoted to nonviolence, nonviolent methods, nonviolent resistance. They talked our way out of the British Empire. And over 3 years in power, they put the key elements of democratic justice in place. The strategy of nonviolent resistance would break up the empires, spreading from Canada to Australia, New Zealand, India, Africa, the Caribbean. For a very long time, this model was understood throughout the empires to have begun with LaFontaine and Baldwin. And then the complexities and veils of memory slowly took over. Eventually, Gandhi took up this model, then Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela. None of which would erase prejudice or racism or exclusion or inequality. Far from it. But they had set a standard. Michael.
Thank you, John. We have, each of us, had the privilege and the honor of delivering the LaFontaine-Baldwin Lecture. And now, in this year of crisis, we're gathering for something different. Perhaps, John, we should call it the LaFontaine-Baldwin dinner table conversation, because that's the spirit in which we gather. We gather to reflect on this moment, what it means for a just society, what it means for the future, what kind of society we hope will emerge from this, in many ways, a critical moment as we all contend with the pandemic and also the discontents that roil politics around the world. So I'd like to begin by putting a question, a challenge to each of the members of this dinner party to say in a single sentence, if you can, what you think is the single most important lesson we have learned from this moment of crisis, this pandemic, about our society and ourselves. Who would like to begin?
I would say that the thing that I have learned the most is through the health crisis, which is what this in a way is, though it means a tremendous burden on all of us all over the world at the same time. It's not happened in any of our lifetimes before, that it has revealed something that we have to take extremely seriously and do something about, like now, not when the crisis is over. And that is 3 systemic problems revealed deeply: systemic racism, systemic ageism, and misogyny. That is systemic anti-female things. And I think those revelations, seeing that people, because of their race and where they live because of their race, are more prone to getting the disease and therefore of dying, that older people, because we have warehoused them, are dying, that kind of systemic thing which we have accepted and say we're going to take care of, has revealed what really has to be changed now, and not when the crisis is over, but starting now.
So Adrian points to systemic inequality, discrimination, especially racism, ageism, and misogyny, revealed, cast in sharp relief by this crisis. Is there someone who would like to respond to Adrian's list, what's been revealed? Louise?
I agree, obviously, with Adrian, but I think I would probably want to expand that a little bit. And in a sense, this will very much echo the lecture I gave at the LaFontaine-Baldwin Lecture. So Adrian has pointed out essentially the evil effects of inequality, inequities, and so on in our system. I think actually it has also revealed the poverty of our lack of commitment and entrenchment of what are called economic, social, and cultural rights. And at the heart of all this is the poverty of our ways of dealing with right to health, right to housing, right to education, to take three. In comparison, I would suggest, and Beverly will probably have a lot to say on that, with the extraordinary progress we've made, at least in this country, more on the social and political rights and on some of the equality rights. This is in many ways a human rights crisis.
A human rights crisis. Beverly?
Yeah, I agree with what Adrian and Louise have said. I've been profoundly disturbed, however, and wondering about what's really going on. It seems to me that the rifts that we're seeing develop are showing that the institutions and our way of going about creating better conditions or equality or so on, all the things we've been doing, they're not working very well. We're seeing the fault lines of our society. We're seeing people pitted against each other. We're seeing increases, of course, in racism, ageism, and misogyny. And I think that we're in a time of unraveling, which sounds very pessimistic on its face, but I like to take an optimistic view. We've had unravelings in history before, and they produce often a vacuum and better things, more up-to-date things. People say, no, what we were doing wasn't working. It hasn't eradicated racism. It hasn't ended ageism. It hasn't been perfect. What do we need to do better? So I'm hoping that as we come out of this crisis, we will be doing a lot of thinking about new approaches, how we can make our institutions better. You know, we're all very good at saying it's wrong, we've got to do something. But I think that we've been working with, in many cases, outdated institutions from the 19th century, ideas from the 19th century. I think we need to modernize the whole system when this is all over.
Great, thank you, Beverly. A time of unraveling and also a time, Adam, of faltering institutions. Is that what you gleaned from this moment? What do you think?
Well, let me be marginally contrarian in the midst of this panel. One of the things that I've noticed and written about is that pretty much everybody finds in the pandemic proof of whatever they believed before the pandemic began. If you were on the American left with me, you see it as proof that we desperately need here in America, where I sit, a Canadian-style national healthcare system. If you were on the right when it began, like my friend Neil Ferguson, it's proof that big, unwieldy, multinational groupings like the European Union are doomed, and only smart, swinging societies like Singapore and South Korea can manage a pandemic. Two things strike me, and I think that they're worth saying, and in that mildly contrarian way. First, that I don't think anybody can begin to predict what the long-term outcome of the pandemic will be. Pandemics are part of human history, and typically, as a matter of simple fact, when a pandemic ends, what happens often is not that we all learn a useful lesson and we reform our behavior, but that we have a big party. That's what happened after the end of the last comparable pandemic, the Spanish flu of 1918, 1919. Here in New York, it cued off not a new era of restraints, austerity, and self-understanding. It keyed off the Jazz Age, the biggest and gaudiest party in American history. Same thing's true about the, even about the Black Plague in Florence in the 14th century. Demolished, devastated half the population of Florence. By 1420, Florence was once again the most creatively dynamic city, perhaps in the history of the West. So I think we should be cautious in our guesses. The single empirical result that I think is the most striking and instructive about the pandemic so far is the paradox of social capital. The paradox seems to be that cities and societies with very high levels of social capital, social trust, community, and so on, like Northern Italy, like New York City, were incredibly vulnerable to the pandemic when it began. They became the hotspots and the epicenters, and then were able to learn the lessons of public safety and public trust more rapidly than other places could. So we climbed up the highest, and then we came down and still remain down, most reliable as compared here locally to the red states where the climb continues, or to other places in Europe which didn't have the same levels of social capital. I spoke last year about the longevity of liberal institutions, and we're at a testing point for liberal institutions. One of the things we're learning is that they're incredibly vulnerable, but also extremely resilient.
I want to come back to the question of the strength or the weakness of liberal institutions, but I want first to get people's reactions to Adam's, what he called a gently contrarian point, that people are learning lessons from the pandemic that essentially restate the convictions and the principles that they had before the pandemic. Just to test that challenge of Adam's, in light of the experience of the pandemic, is there anyone who's learned a lesson that is different from a view they would have had before the pandemic?
I'm not sure that my worldview has changed or my opinions have changed, but like Adam, I live in Manhattan, and so it's been an experience, right? Like the last 6 months, it's been an experience, and it's challenged a lot of like I think different circumstances call for different ways of being, right? And so one of the things that has been challenged for me personally is, like, I'm a city person, and I have always considered myself to be a city person, and I like density, and I like noise, and I like access to a lot of stuff. And a lot of what is awesome about New York has gone away during the pandemic time, right? We've seen some, I think, like flowering of lovely things, like the mutual aid networks. People are helping each other, and the density enables and allows for that in ways that I think are kind of wonderful, right? But I think that different circumstances call for different kinds of solutions, and I'm not sure that cities are going to be the place that people choose. I don't want to reopen. I know there's a big war going on right now in the media about, like, is everybody leaving New York? Should everybody leave New York? Do real New Yorkers leave, et cetera, right? But I think that the circumstances have changed in a way, and we can expect more of that with climate change and, extreme weather events and stuff like that. It may be that we want to react differently by changing our circumstances, including things like questioning stuff like, are cities the place to be for people in these times?
Right.
That's not an ideological change. That's a practical accommodation, right?
No, Nahid, what do you think? Are there any lessons that we've learned from the pandemic that we didn't know before?
My position is an interesting one because, of course, for the last 6 months, I've been on the front lines or on the front of a Zoom call in trying to run a big complex institution that is attempting to respond to what is happening before us. What we've learned is both the incredible worth and value of community, but also the danger of community. From the beginning of this, I've been saying that we'll get through this pandemic the way we get through all of the challenges we have here on this land, and that is together. However, the conversations that we've been having around the things that Adrian has raised, particularly on racism, but I love that you brought up ageism and misogyny as part of that conversation as well, have also shown that although the majority of folks have found this pandemic as a way to build community, we also have a segment of our community that has found this as an excuse, as permission to be able to become more insular, to be able to work only on the issues that are important to them and their own families. And so certainly it is the case that as much of us have achieved an awakening in terms of thinking about how we go from inclusion and diversity to actively anti-racist, the white supremacists are also calling this the moment of their great awakening. And when I put in, my council and I put in a bylaw that you have to wear masks indoors, some 88% of Calgarians said, thank you, that was the right thing to do. But we also got crazy people rallying against masks on the steps of City Hall every day. And so for me, the big lesson here is that in previous crises, and I've been through too many of them in my public life, the thing that we always went to, the thing that we could always depend upon, was that community would do the right thing. But what we're finding here is there is a segment of the community that has lost the ability to understand what the right thing is. And that's what I worry about, that the rebuild needs to be a rebuilding of our sense of compassion and our sense of empathy that I have always taken for granted. And the vast majority of people, I think, still have that those loud voices that are not speaking from a place of empathy is what makes me nervous about that unraveling. So I don't think our institutions are unraveling. I think that, in fact, our institutions have by and large done a marvelous job in keeping people safe and looking after their physical, mental, and economic health. But I do think the community is unraveling in a way I've never seen before.
We've been talking about broad themes from 30,000 feet, but you brought up the subject of masks and mask mandates. Masks have become a flashpoint in the culture wars during this crisis.
I think it's important to remember that in any major crisis, tragedy is usually matched by irony. That's just how we get through these things. And so when it comes to masks, we have to remember that for thousands of years, all of us, including in the West, wore hats, wore capes, wore veils for safety, for health, for privacy, and so on. And it was really only in about 1960 that this all really came to an end. John F. Kennedy, one of the characteristics of his campaign was that he wouldn't wear a hat. And it changed what men would wear. And so in a funny way, after this battle from the 60s on to not wear things, this crisis has forced us back into wearing things on our faces, on our heads. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of the people who were for keeping hats and veils in 1960 are for keeping them off today. But, that's just a guess. The important thing is just to keep remembering that these are really about need, about safety, and about social habit.
George, how do you interpret this debate, this surprising, perhaps, debate over mask wearing? Do you have thoughts about it?
Well, I think you're right. It is a very strange debate, but it has everything to do with the simple fact that every crisis, no matter what it is, reveals the pre-existing conditions of fracture and strain and division in whatever society or societies that are experiencing the crisis or crises. And I like what Adam was saying earlier about the notion of social capital, which, if I interpret it appropriately, seems to basically boil down to a sense of trust. And so I think that those who are opposed to public health measures that are meant to keep us all safe and keep our loved ones safe, keep each other safe, keep our community safe, accept those public health directives on a basis of trust in government, trust that the people that we have elected in democracies to look out for the entirety of the society are relying on the best information available, scientific, medical, economic for that matter, in putting forward the various measures that are meant to help us get through this pandemic. But if there's an underlying condition of mistrust that has always been there, for whatever reasons, but most likely related to class, as well as to race, as well as to gender and other divides, then you're going to have pushback from those groups who do not feel that government or social institutions have ever really worked to their benefit or for their health and well-being. And so there's going to be a reluctance to accept whatever kind of mandate might be put forward by governments in particular and other institutions, if there isn't an underlying belief that they really do mean the best for us. So I think that's what's going on. It is tied to an ideological divide. But that ideological divide comes down to a history for various groups of feeling dispossessed, unheard, silenced, oppressed, downpressed, to use the Rastafarian term. And so if you're beginning from that position of mistrust, distrust, it's going to be very difficult to get anywhere close to 100% of support for any particular initiative.
How do you get people to pull together for things like that when they don't basically feel that their society cares at all about them? And I think that's one of the big fault lines between Canada and the United States, is that for all that we shout and scream, and there may be people who don't want to wear masks and so on, we basically have healthcare that looks after people. And so that is a part of our social contract, which I think is fundamental to us and will help us recover from this situation. People do not get it. They don't see it. They don't see that there's a link between what we want, what we say we want economically as a country, and what we actually will do to our own land and our own resources in order to bring it about. And that causes cynicism, that causes people to distrust, and that's the whole pitting of capitalism and development against what we know and understand as taking care and being stewards of our land and where we live.
Part of the crisis we face is a crisis of facts, that we don't have an agreed upon set of facts. Now, what you've just suggested, George, is that what may seem to be a debate about science, for or against, is really a debate about trust and distrust. Is that what's at stake in the seeming resistance in some quarters of science and accurate facts about the medical situation, you think?
Well, those who have felt maligned by elites, the meritocracy, to use your term, are going to be less likely to want to automatically accept the dictates of doctors, physicians, and politicians who may say that they really mean the best for everyone, but again, there may have been a history of distrust of these very same elites for a very long time, that the pandemic has now allowed that distrust to be amplified, of course, through the wizardry of social media as well, so that part of the rejection, to come back to the whole question of the mask, part of the rejection of the mask, I think, is also a rejection of those liberal elites, as some people might see them, and a completely superstitious kind of response that is on one hand nonsensical, and on the other hand extremely sensible, because the same people who are ordering us to wear masks have also been saying, and coming back to your arguments as well, Michael, are also saying that it's okay if your jobs get shipped overseas. Don't worry about it. We're going to take care of you anyway. Even if you have a lower quality of life, lower standard of living, that's all right. Accept our rulemaking, because it really is the best for you and best for the economy.
All right. So George has put this in a wider frame, but where there are others, I want to see if there is someone who disagrees with George in the way he's interpreted this debate about science. And I can see Adam already shifting in his seat as he's listening to George. Do you see it the same way, Adam?
No, in all honesty, I don't see it in anything like that way. It seems to me that is the on the part of those of us who belong to that liberal meritocratic elite, that's our attempt to lend a sympathetic reading to Trumpism. Because that's the essence of Trumpism, to say that we don't have to pay attention to an educated elite. We don't have to pay attention to people who have expertise about something, because through our intuitions, through our folk wisdom, through the charismatic power of the autocratic leader, we know already. You can rip people open and shine lights inside them. That'll cure it. You can take patent medicines and that'll cure it. The revolt against organized intelligence is not something that I think we should be sympathetic to. That's Trumpism in its purest form. The notion that science is obviously fallible, imperfect, and so on is very different from the idea there's anything healthy or positive or salubrious in the Trumpite revolt against expertise and the Trumpite hatred of the supposed condescension of people who actually know something about the subject.
Well, how do you view these things, John?
Well, I mean, I do think that there is a major problem. I mean, on the one hand, we have this wonderful moment. We've never known so much. We've never had so many people who know so much. And when I have my heart transplant, I don't want Beverly doing it. When I have a legal problem, I want Beverly doing it or Louise doing it, right? So we all know, I think we all know that we've never been so advanced, but I think there's a major, major problem with silos, with attitude, and with the return of class in a major way throughout the Western democracies. We have an appalling situation of class, which is a great deal more than the financial differences. But I do think, and it goes back to the beginning of the conversation, that there's no such thing as a major crisis which is on one subject. It comes up, economic, medical, whatever it is, and because it's a major crisis, it reveals everything else that doesn't work. And so suddenly, you know, we have sort of Hydra head, and it's medical, and it's law, and it's injustice, and it's poverty, and it's racism. And then the real question is, what are you going to do about it? We have to deal with the racism, with the financial inequities, and all the rest of it. Subconsciously, people know this is happening, and where are we going to go with this? What are we going to do with this? And someone like the head is seeing it in the city, you know, every single day in a way that I guess none of us quite see it, but you know.
What struck me right at the beginning of the pandemic was the very big difference between the overall public reaction to the pandemic and the reaction there had been to 9/11. Immediately after 9/11, it was us and them. If you're not with me, you're against me. There's us and the terrorists. And of course, nobody identified with the terrorists. As a result of that, we were prepared, in the US in particular, in the Western world generally, to surrender a lot of our so-called cherished rights. All of a sudden, the Convention Against Torture was not all that important, because if it was to be applied against the terrorists and not us, it was that divide. With the pandemic, everybody understands and admits the consequences may be different, but admits that we were, all of us, everybody on earth is at once a potential victim and a potential perpetrator, even though it could be inadvertent. Why then it led us to why do some people object to wearing masks and so on? It's not because they're terrorists or they think that. So the divide, I think, came from something else. And that brought us to the debate about science. I think what we're missing when we talk about us, the rational neoliberals and so on who think about science providing a lot of guidance, if not all the answers, is that we have found no replacement for having evacuated faith from our way of thinking. I come from a society, from Quebec society, which in the last decade or so has been obsessed with secularism. And yet people of my generation, rational people, for a long time, some still, fewer, were prepared to accommodate their rational reliance on science with their faith in God, even in the Immaculate Conception. And we manage to live with a high level of irrationality. It provided us lots of good things, social cohesion, comfort, and we've rejected that in many others, and we found no replacement for the fact that science doesn't provide all the answers. If it did, you know, scientific had told us when exactly life begins after conception, we wouldn't have an abortion debate the way we have it. And I think the same is true on the response to the pandemic and will be true with respect to climate change. So what is the replacement, in a sense, for having kind of washed out this very comforting, cohesive element of the irrational in the way we deal with each other?
Adam, Louise has thrown down a kind of gauntlet to you at the far end of the dinner table. She's described the confidence, if I can call it that, and she was suggesting perhaps even the smug confidence of what she called rational neoliberal elites who invoked science. And yet, you, Adam, spoke about the erosion, you spoke of social capital. Louise spoke about the loss of social cohesion. And Louise seems to be suggesting that the loss of social cohesion has something to do with the triumph or the predominance of rational, neoliberal, secular orientations to things, and that rational neoliberal elites have not found a substitute source of social cohesion.
I don't know this smug liberal elite, which everyone is talking about. The people I've spent my life with tend to be hugely self-castigating, self-interrogating, exactly like this dinner party, exactly like this panel, right? We're all members. If anyone belongs to that supposed elite, it's these folks. What do? Do we boast? No, we self-interrogate. We self-criticize. We mock and undermine our own supposed beliefs. I think it's a mistake to ever put these arguments, these large arguments about the nature of modernity in terms of facts versus faith, because it's self-evident that all facts can only exist within a frame of investigation in terms of a particular problem, particular need. And it's equally apparent that faith is something that we all have of one kind or another. It may be specifically religious faith. It may be an irrational faith in the beauty, as Sue and I share, of the secular city, of its excitements and of its rewards. What I do think, and I will say this unapologetically, is we are right now here in the United States in the midst of, to use John's appropriate term, an existential crisis in which democracy may or may not survive. And in terms of that existential crisis, the argument is not between facts on the one hand and faith on the other. It's between a belief in rational argument and broadly tolerant values on the one hand, and irrational superstition and authoritarian habits of mind, and a rejection, complete rejection of tolerance and pluralism. Those things are cross lines of liberal and conservative, certainly in the Canadian sense, they certainly cross lines of religious belief or a lack of it. Let me be very specific and give you an example, if I may, Louise, of what seems to me the power of secular community to do the work that faith is usually credited with. It's right here in New York City, right? We went through the worst, we were the epicenter of the epicenter. We went through this plague with an intensity that no other place on earth, with the exception of some parts of northern Italy, as I said, did. We lived it, and it was horrific. And yet, what happened? New Yorkers, because they do have a sense of community, a wildly inequitable place, a place with countless flaws, but nonetheless a functioning city where people do still have some level of mutual trust, certainly believe in each other, have to coexist every day. New York is a city of necessary coexistence. They began to wear masks. They began to practice social distancing. They listened exactly to the people who they believed had expertise on the subject. They were guided by rational politicians who talked about the degree of incidence and how we could prevent it and so on. I walk out of the street, onto the street today in Central Park, I will see 90% of the people will be wearing masks. I'll see that when I go out to shop, people will respect. Here in chaotic, anarchic New York, will respect social distancing. That was a form of self-education through rational and plausible argument that is now made that the drop in contagion in New York has been miraculous. We're well under 1% and continuing on that way. That for me is faith. That for me is what secular societies have in place of religious belief, and that empowers them every bit as much as religious belief ever did. So I'm all for faith. I don't think we can function without faith, but I think one of the powerful forms of faith we have is faith in community. It's faith in secular pluralism. And that, if I might add, is exactly what is an existential threat right now. And it breaks my heart to see people who know the means, the methods, the necessity of rational argument undermining it because it's all we've got. It's all we've got. And if we lose that fight and we succumb to irrationalism, as we're this close to doing, it's going to be we won't rebuild it quickly.
But why is it that these people sometimes insist on denying what rationally they think, they should think, is the truth? And we have to understand that people are not always rational. And the emotional and the anger and the mistrust that George talked about take over and make people not want to believe the facts. This becomes a very complex problem. And we don't know how to deal with it, but I think we need to try to find a way to deal with it. We need to talk about it.
And I think we have to be really careful about falling into the Manichaean trap of rational versus irrational. That's exactly what the extremists want. I think it's important to remember the non-rational, which is built in imagination, ethics, and common sense. It's the biggest part of our lives. It's interesting to look at Indigenous philosophy. I mean, it's built in the non-rational. For example, the belief that people in place are one and the same thing. That whole approach has made them real leaders, for example, in where to go in the environmental debate, environmental crisis. So when we're thinking about fears and we're thinking about the complexity of the conversation, I think we have to move into the complexity. And a lot of that complexity lies, I think, in the non-rational.
And I think the challenge that we found is that people are talking in such silos that it is difficult to bring together those sets of facts, those economic, those environmental, those social facts about what our community looks like. And so I think that this is where the fundamental discussion we're having, and if I can highlight the discussion between Adam and George about trust and distrust and how that is playing itself out, I think there's an important assumption that we have to understand here. And that is that if the system worked for everyone, they would trust the system. So it's not just a matter of I'm being fed misinformation, I'm being amped up or juiced up. That certainly is happening. But we also have to understand that there are so many people for whom the system does not work. So to Adrian's point, your grocery clerk gets to go to the same hospital as you, but increasingly in our community, your grocery clerk doesn't get to live in the same neighborhood as you. And consequently, your grocery clerk's kids are not actually going to the same school as your kids because they simply can't afford to live there. You know, there was this piece, I can't remember where it was, but in an American publication recently that was very sort of self-righteous about Canada, and it made this exact point. All the kids go to school together, everybody lives in the same neighborhood, and it was written by a professor at UBC, where nobody can afford to live in Vancouver. So it's actually not true. The person who is serving you at the grocery store has commuted for 2 hours to get to their job at the grocery store. And their kids don't live in the same school division as your kids. And so fundamentally, we got to understand, and I think the discussion we've had about racism, this has been hard for me. I have been talking for years about how Canada is perhaps the best example of multiculturalism in the world today, certainly, but perhaps in human history. But the conversations that we've been having about the very lived experience of Black, Indigenous, and people of color have really led me to go, is it possible? And I'm actually fascinated to know what all these big brains on this group, if I can take your role for a second, Michael, think about this question, which is it possible to hold two thoughts simultaneously in your head? Which is, we live in a place that we should be proud of because it is inclusive, it is diverse. A kid like me from Northeast Calgary can be the mayor and nobody bats an eye about it. But we are not yet an anti-racist society. And the lived experience of too many of our neighbors is not the experience that we tell ourselves is the Canadian experience. Can you hold both of those thoughts simultaneously?
I'd like to pick up on the point that Nahed has just made about race, because we're having around the world now, a debate about racial justice and racial injustice. And we've had really two political crises unfolding in parallel over this summer. One to do with responses to the pandemic, the other to do with racial injustice and the Black Lives Matter movement. Question I'd like to put to you is this: is it a coincidence that these two very intense political crises happen to be unfolding at the same time, or is there a connection?
I think it's not a coincidence, and I think it's really. I think this is the crux, right? Like this is the real question, right? And I think it's not a coincidence. And I think the reason I think that is because, like when we talk about like what do we owe each other and what is the social contract and all of that kind of thing, the basics. The most important and fundamental thing that government is supposed to do for us is to protect us and make us physically safe, right? Like that's the bottom line. And I think that the moral outrage and the moral failure of the pandemic in the United States and to varying degrees in other countries, but definitely in the United States, is that the government is not living up to that responsibility to try to protect the citizenry in an incredibly difficult circumstances, right? But it is not trying. And I think that is the same thing that is fueling the outrage over police brutality and police violence, is that the government, the law enforcement, the folks who are supposed to protect us are not protecting segments of the society. They're just doing nothing to protect them, right? And in fact, they're harming them and they're killing them. And so I think it's that same, the moral outrage is the same. And the fundamentals of it are the government is supposed to be helping us and protecting us and making us physically secure, and is in fact either not doing that or is doing the opposite of that. I think Canadians comparing ourselves to the United States is really dangerous. And I think it's particularly dangerous at this moment because it gives us a sense of comfort that we have not earned and we shouldn't feel.
This is so Canadian, looking at it from a Canadian perspective. We could at once feel a profound outrage and then pretend that we could be reasonably comfortable because it doesn't happen here, which actually is not correct, is not accurate. But to feel the outrage and the solidarity with the oppressed and so on, and then when it comes to asking whether defunding the police and whether systemic racism exists in Canada, well, all of a sudden, the first thing you hear from a lot of politicians and a lot of members of the public is, well, this is not the United States.
The systemic racism has come up, has become really to the forefront for me, so that now I am going to advocate things that I never advocated before. I'm deeply into this whole thing now about it, and I think we have to do just really vivid, important things to change, really.
The great thing about this pandemic is that it has forcing us to grapple with all of these cleavages in our society. And the only way we're going to emerge from it better is if, in fact, we respect the fact these cleavages exist and try to heal them with a lot of compassion and a lot of public spending.
You know, if I could just say, I think the word that was really missing today from the dinner party was really the word belonging. I don't know if it was said or it was maybe said once. And what's interesting is the things that were brought up by almost everybody were about whether people felt that they belonged or were not included in some way. And it's when Canadians talk about multiculturalism, what they're really talking about is, and diversity, what they're really talking about is the ability of everybody to belong in their own way with their multiple personalities. And I think that's a central concept as to where we go next, whereas we know the rising racism is making this concept harder and harder.
Well, thank you for that. And thanks to all of you for this really remarkable, enriching conversation. Dinner parties have less tidy conclusions than lectures. And the discussion we've had certainly brings that out. We've covered a wide range of topics: interpreting the pandemic, the reckoning with racial injustice, the debate about climate change, the status of science, the self-scrutiny of elites. And in the course of discussing these topics, we found ourselves wrestling with broad questions of trust and distrust, social cohesion, and social unraveling. We've not resolved any of the questions that we've discussed, but we have at least, I hope, shed some light from different angles and directions on the crises that we face today, on the tumultuous time our societies are going through. And also, I think we've seen at least glimmers of hope for what might emerge from this pandemic once we manage to get through it. But they are only glimmers. And to what extent a more just, more inclusive society will be the result, John, is really up to us and our fellow citizens. So with that, I'd like to thank you all very much and turn things back over to John.
Amazing. A remarkable opening of doors, as Michael said, ideas emerging from people who come from such different experiences. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Michael. And this is just the beginning of 6 Degrees 2020. Tune in tomorrow, as they say, same time, 1 p.m. Eastern, for our first ever virtual 360 session. And again on Wednesday, also at 1 p.m. Eastern, to celebrate the 5th Adrienne Clarkson Prize for Global Citizenship. This year, it's being awarded to the remarkable Indigenous leader, Senator Murray Sinclair, a man who has really changed our country and our way of thinking about what happens in our country. And one more thing, in the middle of October, we're going to have a second conversation on today's subject, only this time, the group will be made up of young people, and not that we're not that young, but younger people from around the world. We want to hear their ideas on the same topic. We want to hear what they think about the ideas we put forward today. Miigwech. Merci. Thank you.